I never thought the worst night of my life would also be the night that changed everything. It was past 11, the kind of late where the whole world feels like it's gone to sleep without you. Rain had been coming down since early evening, not the soft kind that taps politely on the windowpane, but the hard, relentless kind that makes you feel like the sky is trying to say something. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched in an hour, staring at a stack of unopened bills that had been staring back at me for 3 days. My name is Caleb Rourke. I'm 36 years old. I live alone on a small property just outside Millhaven, Tennessee, a town so small that people who grew up here either love it fiercely or leave without looking back. I stayed, not because I didn't have places to go, but because this land belonged to my grandfather, and when he died he left it to me with a note that said, "Take care of it like it took care of us." I run a small woodworking shop out of the old barn behind the house. Custom furniture, cabinets, repair work. Nothing that makes a man rich, but enough to keep the lights on and the roof from leaking. Most days I'm up before sunrise and in bed before the news. My life is quiet in the way that feels earned rather than chosen. The kind of quiet that settles in after years of being the only person in a house built for more than one. I had been engaged once, a long time ago. Her name was Donna. She was kind and funny, and she used to sing to herself while she washed dishes, completely unaware she was doing it. We were together 4 years. Then her sister got a job in Seattle, and Donna followed, and the distance did what distance does when two people aren't quite brave enough to fight it. We didn't end badly. We just faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I hadn't been close to anyone since. Not for lack of wanting, more for lack of knowing how to start again once you've already let something good slip through your hands. That was the version of myself sitting at that kitchen table on the night of the storm. 36, alone, half a cup of cold coffee, and the sound of rain so loud it almost drowned out the knock at the door. Almost. I heard it the second time, 3 knocks, not frantic, careful, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure they had the right place. I pushed back from the table and walked to the door. The porch light was on but weak, the bulb I'd been meaning to replace for 2 months still flickering at the edge of its life. Through the frosted glass panel I could make out a shape, small, still, soaked through. I opened the door. She was standing in the rain with her arms wrapped around herself, wearing a light gray jacket that was so wet it had gone nearly black at the shoulders. Her dark hair was plastered against her face. She was holding a canvas bag against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She looked at me with eyes that were red around the edges, not from the rain. She had been crying long before she got to my door. She said my name first, which caught me off guard because I didn't recognize her. "Are you Caleb Rourke?" I said yes. My voice came out careful the way it does when you're not sure what you're walking into. She swallowed. Her jaw tightened like she was holding something back, trying to get the words out in the right order. "My name is Nora Callahan." She paused. "My husband was Daniel Callahan. He told me, before he died, he told me to find you." The rain hammered the roof. I stood there for a moment, just holding the door, trying to place the name. Daniel Callahan. I turned it over in my mind, the way you reach for something on a shelf in a dark room, not sure if you're going to find it. And then I did. Daniel Callahan. 11 years ago, a Tuesday in November, cold enough to see your breath. I was 25, driving home from a supply run on Route 9, and there was a car in the ditch on the east side of the road. A blue Civic with the front end buried in the soft shoulder and the hazard lights blinking slow and orange in the dark. I pulled over without thinking. The driver was a man maybe 10 years older than me, sitting behind the wheel with blood on his forehead where it had hit the steering wheel. Not serious, but he was dazed and the door was jammed and the night was cold enough to matter. I got him out, called the ambulance from my cell phone, which barely had signal out there, waited with him on the side of the road until the lights came. His name, when he finally told me, was Daniel Callahan. He shook my hand with both of his when the paramedics arrived. He said, "You didn't have to stop." I told him of course I did. I never saw him again. I never thought about it again, honestly. It was the kind of thing you do without needing it to mean something. You see someone who needs help, you help them, you go home. But apparently, Daniel Callahan had thought about it for 11 years. I stepped back from the door. "Come inside," I said. "Please." She hesitated for just a second. Then she walked past the threshold, and I closed the door against the storm. She stood in my entry hall, dripping onto the hardwood, looking around the way people do when they're trying to get their bearings in an unfamiliar place. I went and got a towel from the hall closet, one of the thick ones I kept for guests I almost never had. "Here." I handed it to her. She took it and pressed it against her face, and for a moment I saw something crack in her composure, just for a second, the smallest tremor at the corner of her mouth. Then she pulled it back together. I asked if she wanted tea or coffee. She said tea. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and tried to organize my thoughts while I listened to her quiet movements in the hallway. When she came into the kitchen, she looked smaller somehow. She sat down at the table and placed the canvas bag carefully in her lap. Her hands were still shaking slightly. Whether from cold or from something else, I couldn't tell yet. I set the tea in front of her and sat down across the table. I waited. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked down at it for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were steady but raw, the way eyes get when someone has been crying on and off for days and has run out of new tears to produce. "Daniel died 8 weeks ago," she said. "Heart attack. He was 49. I said I was sorry. I meant it, even though I'd only met the man once. Something about the way she said it, 8 weeks, like she was still counting, still keeping track, told me everything about what those 8 weeks had been. "He left a letter," she said, "with his will. The lawyer gave it to me the day after the funeral." She paused. "He left several letters, actually. One for their daughter, one for his brother, one for his old business partner." She looked at me, "And one with your name on it." I didn't speak. "It took me this long to come," she said quietly. "I kept telling myself I'd wait until things settled. But things don't settle. They just keep moving, and you either move with them or you don't." She looked out the rain-streaked window. "Tonight I just got in the car." She reached into the canvas bag and took out an envelope. It was plain white, slightly worn at the corners from handling. My name was on the front in careful, deliberate handwriting. "Caleb Rourke, Millhaven, Tennessee." She slid it across the table to me. I looked at it for a moment before I picked it up. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on plain-lined paper. His handwriting was even and unhurried, the kind that takes its time. "Dear Caleb, you don't know me well enough to remember me, and that's all right. My name is Daniel Callahan. You pulled me out of a ditch on Route 9 on November 14th, 11 years ago. It was cold. My head was bleeding and the door wouldn't open, and you stopped when you didn't have to. I've thought about that night more times than I can count. Not because it was dramatic. I know it probably didn't feel that way to you. But I had been having a hard year. A hard few years, honestly. I had lost my father the previous spring. My business was struggling. My marriage was in a rough place. I was driving home that night, feeling like I was losing my grip on things I couldn't afford to lose. And then the car went off the road, and you stopped. There's something that happens to a man when a stranger treats him with simple human decency at exactly the moment he needs it most. It sounds small. It wasn't small to me. I went home that night, and I told my wife about you. I told her you restored something in me that I hadn't realized I'd lost. I kept your name. I looked you up. I know that sounds strange. I want you to understand I wasn't going to interfere in your life. I kept track of you. The way you keep a photograph in a drawer, not because you look at it every day, but because knowing it's there matters. I know you live alone. I know you run the woodworking shop. I know you're a good man. The kind of person who stops on a cold night when no one is watching, and no one would know the difference if you didn't. I'm writing this letter because I'm sick. I don't have a great deal of time. I'm writing this letter because my wife, Nora, is going to need someone. Not immediately. She is far stronger than she knows. But eventually, she's been carrying more than her share for a long time. And when I'm gone, there will be no one to make sure she doesn't disappear into the weight of it. I'm not asking you to love her. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm asking you to be the kind of person you already are. The kind who stops. If she finds her way to your door, please open it. Thank you for November 14th. Daniel Callahan. I set the letter down on the table. The rain outside had softened slightly. The kettle had long since gone quiet. The kitchen felt very still. Nora was watching me. She had clearly read the letter herself. I could tell by the way she was tracking my reaction, waiting to see what the words did to someone new. I want you to know, she said carefully, that I didn't come here because Daniel told me to. I came because I've spent 8 weeks trying to figure out why he wrote this. Why you? A man he met once, 11 years ago, on the side of a road. She looked at the letter between us, and the only answer I keep coming back to is that he trusted something in you that he couldn't find anywhere else to put. She looked up at me. That scared me, she said, but it also felt like something I couldn't ignore. I looked at her across the table. This woman I had never met, sitting in my kitchen at nearly midnight, soaking wet and exhausted and braver than she probably knew. She had driven through a storm to knock on a stranger's door because her dead husband had asked her to. Not out of obedience, out of something harder to name, something that looked a lot like courage wearing the clothing of grief. I said the only thing that felt honest. I'm glad you came. She stayed that night, not in any complicated way. I gave her the spare room at the end of the hall. She closed the door, and I went back to the kitchen and sat with Daniel Callahan's letter until almost 2 in the morning, reading it again, and then once more. A man I met once on a cold night 11 years ago had held on to something I did without thinking, and turned it into a belief about who I was. I wasn't sure I deserved that belief, but I was going to try. In the morning the rain had stopped. I was up early the way I always am, and I made coffee and eggs and toast and set the table for 2, which I hadn't done in longer than I wanted to count. When Nora came downstairs, she stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw the table. She said, "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know." We ate without saying very much, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have already said something important and don't need to fill the air with lesser words. After breakfast, she told me about Daniel. Not the illness. She wasn't ready for that yet. She told me the other parts. How they met at a mutual friend's wedding in Nashville when she was 24, and he kept finding excuses to refill her glass, and she finally told him he could just ask her to dance instead. How they built a life in Millhaven. He ran a small contracting company. She taught 2nd grade. How their daughter Clara was now 8 years old and had her father's stubborn jaw and her mother's eyes, and had spent the last 8 weeks sleeping with a photograph of him under her pillow. That last part she said very quietly, looking at her coffee. I asked about family, about people who were helping. She told me her parents were in Florida, elderly and not well themselves. Daniel's brother lived in Ohio and called every week, but calling and being present were different things. Her friends in town were kind, but grief is uncomfortable for the people still standing outside it, and visits tapered off after the first month the way visits do. I'm not looking for rescue, she said. Plainly, not defensively, the way someone says something they've had to say too many times. I want you to know that. Clara is okay, we're managing. I nodded. Daniel didn't say you needed rescuing, I said. He said you needed someone to make sure you didn't disappear. She went very still. Then she looked out the kitchen window at the wet yard, the barn, the pale morning sky just starting to turn gold at the edges. Her voice came out quieter. He knew me well. She left after breakfast. Before she left, she stood on the porch and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something between gratitude and uncertainty. Like she wasn't sure what any of this meant yet and wasn't going to pretend she did. She said, "I don't know what comes next." I said, "Neither do I." "But you know where I am." She nodded once, got into her car, drove away down the wet gravel road while the morning light came through the trees. I stood on the porch for a while after she was gone. I thought about Daniel Callahan keeping my name for 11 years, keeping track, believing something about a stranger based on 5 minutes on a cold roadside. It wasn't strange. It wasn't intrusive. It was faithful, like he had found a small piece of evidence that goodness existed in the world and refused to set it down. She called 3 days later. It was a Tuesday evening and I was finishing a cabinet door, sanding the edges by hand. My phone was on the workbench and I almost missed it. "Hi," she said. "It's Nora." There was a pause, like she wasn't sure what came next. I said, "Hi, Nora." She said Clara had asked about where she'd gone that night in the storm. She had told her the truth, that she'd gone to see a man her father had written about, a man who had been kind to him once. Clara had apparently thought about this for a long moment and then asked, "Is he nice?" Nora said she'd told her yes. I didn't say anything. I just let that sit there in the warm air of the workshop. She asked if she could bring Clara to see the woodworking shop sometime. Clara liked making things. Daniel had taught her to use a hammer before she turned 5, and she had been proud of it ever since. I said of course. I smiled after I hung up. I hadn't expected that. They came the following Saturday morning. Clara got out of the car first, small for 8, with dark hair and 2 braids and her mother's careful, watching eyes. She stopped a few feet from me and looked at me the way children look at strangers, direct and entirely without guile. She said, "Are you the man who helped my dad?" I said yes. She considered this. Then she said, "He talked about you sometimes. He said you stopped when nobody else did." I looked at Nora over the top of Clara's head. Nora's expression was unreadable and tender at the same time. I crouched down to Clara's level. "Your dad was the kind of man who remembered things that mattered. That says more about him than it does about me." Clara thought about this with the seriousness of a child who takes ideas carefully. Then she said, "Can I see the workshop?" I laughed. It came out real and unguarded, and I hadn't heard myself laugh like that in a while. "Yeah," I said, "come on." That morning went longer than I expected. Clara was fascinated by everything. The tools on their pegboard, the half-finished pieces, the way different woods had different colors and smells. She asked questions without stopping, the real kind that come from actual wanting to know. I answered every one. I let her sand a small piece of scrap pine with a fine grit block. She took it so seriously, her brow furrowed, her small hands moving carefully back and forth, that I had to look away for a second, because something about it got to me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Nora stood in the doorway of the workshop watching us. She held a coffee mug I'd given her in both hands, quiet in the way people are quiet when they are feeling something they're not ready to put into words. When we came out into the yard afterward, Clara ran to look at the vegetable garden along the south fence. I stood near Nora. She said quietly, without looking at me, "She laughed in there." I waited. "She hasn't laughed like that since he died." She stopped. "Thank you." I said, "She's easy to be around. She's got his quality, the thing where you feel like what you say actually matters to her." Nora turned and looked at me. There was something in her eyes I didn't want to name too quickly, something fragile and beginning. She said, "He would have liked you." I looked out at Clara crouching in the garden. "I think I would have liked him too," I said. The weeks that followed were careful. Neither of us rushed or pushed toward anything. But the calls came more often, sometimes about practical things, sometimes about nothing in particular, conversations that started with a reason and then kept going past it. I got used to the sound of her voice in the evenings. I noticed when a few days passed without hearing it. One afternoon in early December she called, and she didn't sound right. Her voice was flat and too controlled, the way voices get when someone is holding themselves very still. I asked what was wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said Clara had come home from school crying. A girl in her class had said something. Children are precise and merciless without meaning to be. That Clara couldn't be in the father-daughter holiday event because she didn't have a dad anymore. Clara had held it together until she got home. Then she hadn't. Nora's voice cracked on the last word. I sat with that for a second. Then I said, "When is the event?" She told me. 2 weeks away, a Saturday morning. "I'll come," I said. If that's what Clara wants, if you're both okay with it. Silence on the line. Long enough that I wondered if I'd overstepped. Then Nora said, very quietly, I'll ask her. She called back an hour later. She said Clara had listened to the question very carefully, the way she did with everything, and then she had asked one question of her own. Does he know how to clap loudly? I laughed out loud, standing alone in my kitchen. Tell her yes, I said. Tell her I've been practicing. The father-daughter event was at the school gymnasium on a Saturday morning in mid-December. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling on fishing line. Clara wore a red dress and her hair in one braid, and she was so serious about every step of the dance that I had to work to keep up with her. At one point she looked up at me mid-spin and said, completely matter-of-fact, "You're not as bad as I thought you'd be." I said, "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me all year." She grinned. It was her father's grin, I could tell somehow, even though I'd only seen Daniel Callahan's face in the dim light of a roadside 11 years ago, something about the particular unself-consciousness of it. I felt something shift in my chest. Not toward Clara only, toward the whole of it. This strange, ordinary, improbable morning. The red dress, the paper snowflakes, the fact that I was here at all. Nora was waiting in the hallway outside when the event ended. She had coffee in 2 paper cups from the machine at the far end. She handed me one and looked at Clara, who immediately started telling her every detail of the dance with the precision of a court reporter. When Clara ran ahead to the bathroom, Nora turned to me. She was wearing a dark green sweater and her hair down, and the gymnasium light was doing something warm to her face. She said, "Thank you for this." I said, "I didn't do anything. I just showed up." She said, "That's the whole thing, Caleb. That's the entire thing." I understood what she meant, and I understood that I was falling in love with her. Not because of Daniel's letter, not out of obligation or the particular tenderness that grief can sometimes trick you into feeling, but because of her specifically, her steadiness, her honesty, the way she protected Clara without making Clara feel protected, the way she said exactly what she meant without ornament, the way she laughed when she wasn't expecting to, sudden and unguarded and real. I had been alone for a long time, long enough that I had gotten used to solitude the way you get used to a bad knee, managing around it, compensating, eventually forgetting what it felt like when it didn't hurt. Nora had walked through my door in the rain, and slowly, without either of us planning it, the absence at the center of my life had started to fill. I was terrified of that. I didn't say anything that day. I drove home and walked around the property in the cold afternoon light, trying to sort myself out, trying to determine whether what I was feeling was something real or something manufactured by circumstance. A grieving woman, a dead man's letter, a child with her father's grin, all of it pressed together in a way that could make anyone confuse gratitude for something deeper. But when I sat down and was honest with myself, I knew the difference. I'd felt gratitude before. This wasn't gratitude. This was the particular terror of wanting something you're not sure you deserve. Christmas came and went. I spent it quietly, the way I always did. On the day after Christmas, Nora called and asked if I wanted to come for dinner. Clara was with Daniel's brother for the week. The house was quiet, she said, and she had made too much soup. She said it lightly, but I heard the underneath of it. I drove over that evening, through the cold dark. Her house was a white farmhouse, set back from the road, with a porch light on and the windows warm with interior light. It looked like exactly what it was, a place someone had built a life in and was fighting to keep standing. She opened the door before I knocked. We ate at the kitchen table, a thick vegetable soup with bread she'd made herself. We talked the way we'd been talking for months, easy and unhurried. Topics drifting between Clara and work and memories and the particular strangeness of the year behind us. After dinner we sat in the living room with the lights low and a fire going in the small fireplace. I noticed the wood was stacked wrong and the fire wasn't drawing right. I almost didn't say anything. Then I did. "Can I adjust the fire?" She blinked. "What's wrong with it?" "The logs are too close together. It's not getting enough air." She looked at the fireplace and then back at me, and then she laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, surprised out of her. "By all means," she said. I fixed the fire. It caught properly within a minute, the flame settling into something steadier and stronger. I came back and sat down, and she was still smiling. She said, "Is there anything you can't fix?" I thought about it honestly. "Plenty," I said. "I'm just good at fires and wood." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then she said, without turning toward me, "Caleb." I said, "Yeah." "What are we doing?" The question landed in the warm room and stayed there. I looked at her profile in the firelight, the careful, honest way she faced everything, including this. I said, "I think you know what we're doing." She turned and looked at me. Her eyes were serious and a little afraid and entirely open. "I'm not ready," she said. "I want you to know that. I don't know if I'll be ready for a long time. I still wake up some mornings and reach for him and he's not there. I still find his handwriting on grocery lists and I have to sit down." She stopped. "I'm not telling you this to push you away. I'm telling you because you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort." I said, "I know. I don't want to use you," she said. "I don't want you to be something I lean on because he's gone and you're kind and Clara loves you. I don't want to confuse need for something it isn't." I looked at the fire for a moment, then I looked at her. "Nora," I paused. "I'm not in a hurry. I've been alone for a long time. A little longer doesn't scare me." Another pause. "But I want you to know what's true. What I feel for you is not circumstance. It's not because of Daniel's letter. It's because of you, specifically you, the way you move through things, the way you are with Clara, the way you tell the truth even when the comfortable thing would be easier. I'm not asking for anything tonight. I'm just not going to pretend I don't feel what I feel." She looked at me for a long time. Then she reached across the small space between us and placed her hand over mine. She didn't squeeze it, just placed it there, warm and deliberate. "Okay," she said softly. We sat like that by the fire for a long while. Neither of us said anything else about it. We talked about other things. But her hand stayed where it was. And that was enough. Spring came slow that year. Clara's visits continued. Saturday mornings at the workshop, Sunday dinners that became something closer to regular. Clara was building a small wooden box. It took 5 weeks because she insisted on doing every step herself. It came out beautifully, slightly uneven at one corner, which she examined critically and then decided was character rather than flaw. She presented it to Nora with the ceremony of someone handing over something genuinely precious. Nora kept a photograph of Daniel inside it. I saw that and I understood something important. This was not a story about replacing someone. It was never going to be that story. Daniel was real, and he was Clara's father, and he was the man Nora had built her life beside. And that didn't disappear because time passed or because someone new walked in. The photograph would always be there. The grief would always have its room in the house. Love doesn't work by subtraction. You don't love someone less to love someone else more. You just expand. I had been afraid of that without knowing it. Afraid of the particular weight of a life that already had so much history in it. But watching Clara close the lid of that little wooden box, I understood that the history wasn't a burden. It was the foundation. And foundations were something I knew how to work with. One evening in May, Nora and I were sitting on her porch after Clara had gone to bed. The air smelled like cut grass and something blooming in the garden. The sky was the deep blue of late dusk. She said, "I want to tell you something." I waited. "When I first read Daniel's letter, the one he left for me, not yours, he talked about you. He said he had written to you because you were the kind of person who stopped when no one was watching." She paused. "And then he said he hoped I'd have the courage to go find you. He said I deserved someone who would choose me, not because he'd been told to, not out of duty, because I was worth choosing." She looked at me. "I need to know," she said quietly, "that it's a choice, that you're not here because of a letter, that you're not finishing something for him." The night sounds filled the silence between us. Frogs somewhere down by the creek, a car on the distant road. I thought carefully before I spoke. "Daniel's letter got me to open the door," I said slowly. "That's what it did. It made sure I didn't turn you away in the rain because I didn't understand why you were there." I paused. "But everything after that, every conversation, every Saturday morning, every time I've driven home thinking about something you said, none of that is about Daniel. That's about you. You are the reason I'm still here, not his letter. You. She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were bright but steady. Okay, she said. The same word she'd said by the fire in December, but it meant something different now. It meant something decided. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and I put my arm around her, and we sat there until the sky went fully dark and the stars came out one by one over the Tennessee fields. In October, almost exactly a year after the night Nora had knocked on my door, I asked her to marry me. Not in a grand way. We were in my kitchen on a Saturday morning, and she was leaning against the counter while I made coffee. The morning light was coming through the window at that angle it sometimes does in fall, turning everything it touches the color of old honey. I put down the coffee and I said her name. She looked up. I want to marry you, I said. Not because of anything except that my life is better with you in it, and I want it to keep being better. I want Clara to know she can count on me. I want to keep fixing your fireplace and arguing about wood grain and having you tell me the truth when the comfortable thing would be easier. I paused. I want to choose you every day, if you'll let me. She set down her phone. She was quiet for a long moment, the way she always was when she was taking something seriously. Then she said, Clara asked me last week if she thought you would stay. I waited. I told her I thought you were the staying kind. She looked at me. Was I right? Yes, I said. You were right. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around me and said yes against my shoulder. Just yes, quiet and certain, like the answer had been there for a while, and it was simply time to say it out loud. I held on to her in the morning light, and I thought about Daniel Callahan. I thought about how he had kept my name for 11 years, how he had believed something about a stranger based on nothing more than a cold night and a simple act of stopping. How in his last days he had sat down and written a letter, trusting that the goodness he'd seen in me once was still there, still worth trusting. I hoped I was worthy of that. I intended to spend the rest of my life trying to be. We got married the following spring, small and quiet, on the property behind my house. Nora wore a simple cream dress and her hair loose the way I loved it. Clara stood beside her in a lavender dress she had picked herself and held the rings on a small wooden pillow I had made in the workshop, carved with her name on the back where no one would see it but her. Daniel's brother came from Ohio. He shook my hand for a long time without speaking and then said, he would have approved. I thanked him. I meant it. When the ceremony was done, Clara stood between us and took both our hands. She didn't say anything, she just held on. And that was everything. There is a bench in the workshop now, in the corner near the window that looks out over the south field. I built it last winter. Simple pine, smooth finish, the right height for a child to sit and watch without being in the way. Clara uses it on Saturday mornings. She has graduated from small boxes to a bookshelf she is building in stages, measuring twice and cutting once, with the patience of someone who has decided that doing something right is worth taking the time. Nora sometimes comes and stands in the workshop doorway while we work. She holds a coffee mug in both hands the way she did that very first Saturday morning, nearly 2 years ago. She watches Clara. She watches me. Her face in those moments has the particular quality of someone looking at something they didn't know they needed until they found it. I know that feeling. Sometimes I think about the version of myself sitting at that kitchen table the night of the storm. The bills, the cold coffee, the particular weight of a quiet life that had gone on long enough to start feeling permanent. I think about how close I came to not opening the door. How a few more seconds and she might have turned back to her car and driven home through the rain. I am glad I opened the door. I am glad every single day that I opened the door. Because here is what Daniel Callahan understood that I didn't. Not yet. The most important moments of a life are rarely the ones you plan for. They are the ones where someone needs you to simply stop, to open the door, to say, I see you, I'm here. Come in out of the rain. And if you do that, if you can do that, then what comes after is not obligation. It is not duty. It is not finishing something for someone else. It is yours. All of it. The firelight, The wooden box, the lavender dress, the small hands holding yours on the morning you become a family, all of it, entirely and completely yours.